Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
This is big, Peter. This is very big. There's definitely something here.
Egon, this reminded me of the time you tried to drill a hole through your head. Remember that?
That would have worked if you hadn't stopped me.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm joined by Chad Gross. As he takes a drink of coffee, I'm going to ask him, what's new in your world this week, Chad?
My week has been kind of hectic. Been having some nagging health issues. Work's been very stressful. A lot of things going on at home. Not necessarily bad things, but just, things you have to deal with when you have a family, sick kids, and running them here and there. Not when they're sick, of course. And this week has been a bit stressful, a bit hectic, but the podcast is always a great way to kind of decompress from a stressful week. So I'm looking forward to it. How about you? How was your week?
I was able to find solace in going to see Dune.
Oh, I went
and saw
Dune. Wow.
Yeah, so I saw it on IMAX. And my rating, 10 out of 10 stars.
Wow.
I really liked it. Yeah, if I faulted it, it would just be nitpicky details like, oh, well, too many flashbacks. Oh, well, bagpipes in space. Maybe not. But no, it was really, really cool. And I would just wish that, the next movie was out tomorrow, that kind of a thing. So for any Dune fans out there of the books, I went with someone who loves the books, read them all, and hated the 1980s movie and thought it was faithful to the book. I never read really any of the books. I just watched that original 80s Dune movie a lot, and I thought this was awesome. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
So you're saying that your friend who read all the books said that the 1980 version was not faithful to the books?
He didn't like that. He thought it was kind of silly.
Oh, okay.
And there was a couple aspects, like with the weaponry in the 80s movie, that didn't even exist in the book. So like the director at that time didn't want to have martial arts in the desert kind of a thing. So he's like, well, maybe we can use some weapons instead. So he invented a weapon that they used. It was kind of like a gun. So he changed the fighting method. The movie's really great acting, great music, great visuals. Really, you watch it and you're like, wow, this is huge and epic. And no, I would say don't go looking at the reviews. Don't go finding out what's the story about. Just go see it and you probably get more out of it. So
exactly.
Yeah, that's my recommendation.
All right, cool.
So today's podcast, we're going to talk about a cornucopia of topics. I've got about 3 various little topics, some apologetics related and some not. And Chad, you've got a few as well. So we're just going to kind of kick those around. We do have some great further interviews lined up. I'm going to pull out the first topic. Remember when we were talking, Chad, and you said how you were thinking about going back to original sources and how important that is? One of the things that sort of inspired that, as I understand it, and from what you said, was when we were talking to Eric Manning, he would go back and he would talk about, say, classical apologists from 1st, 2nd century or something, and what they wrote about a topic. And then when we talked to J. Warner Wallace in his interview about person of interest, he was talking about how, well, let me just not use the New Testament at the moment because that's the thing I'm questioning as a skeptic. Let me go back to original sources. What can I piece together about the life of this person of interest, Jesus, by going back to original sources? So I thought, oh, you know what? If we wanted to do that, where could we start? So it brought me back to a book I read back in 2008. Wow, so long ago.
Can I interject something real quick before? One of the things that J. Warner Wallace said that I thought was especially challenging was I absolutely think that it's very helpful to go to experts in certain topics because I'm obviously not an expert in most topics. And so I think it's helpful. But one of the things he said was it was interesting and it made me think about, for example, something like some of the arguments that are made nowadays where for example, when William Lane Craig does a debate and he'll quote skeptics that agree with him or something like that. One of the things J. Warner Wallace said is he finds it helpful just to go to the original sources and actually present the facts and evidence because what somebody can do, and I actually saw this in William Lane Craig's debate with Stephen Law, and Stephen Law brought it to bear, was, you can find skeptics who agree with you, a premise of your argument, but I can find Christians who agree with premises of my arguments. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so Wallace's argument was, is it important to go to experts and help them, allow them to help us understand the topics? Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's about facts and arguments. And where are you going to find the facts and arguments? Well, that's going to be in the original literature, because we can always find, if we took a topic, for example, you could find experts on your side. I could find experts on my side. At the end of the day, it's the arguments that ultimately matter. So it's not to minimize the importance of experts, but almost to elevate the importance of arguments and evidence.
Yeah. So I heard an apologist say one time that a lot of the classical works of apologists that we've seemingly forgotten about because there's new books coming out all the time, where some of these classical works, you know, they're 10 times more brilliant than we are today, generally, even with the internet. So, you know, we have to go back to those things. And so I could recommend something like the Library of Historical Apologetics as a good resource.
Oh, yes.
And from there, you could probably determine topics or certain themes that you'd want to read. But I was thinking, well, you know, if I wanted to go back and read, might not know where to begin. So you could either check with Tim McGrew and he could give you some direction in that very, very good idea. Right. Or one book that I read back in the day was called Classical Readings in Christian Apologetics by L. Russ Bush. So it's a compiled collection of some of the best apologetics works. We're talking 100 to 1800 AD. So if you're looking for, you know, where do I start? You could just say, well, let me dip my toe into, say, 12 different classical apologists. So from AD 100 to 1800. So this book is really a handy way to do that. And then maybe you could figure out, well, after reading these 12 guys, I think I'll read more Tertullian or Origen or something. So, and there's a quote by the author. He says, a person's education is not complete if only secondary sources have been read, no matter how fine those sources may be. This observation is true in many areas of study, but especially in apologetics. So that kind of resonates with what we were talking about. So who are these 12 apologists covered in the book? Classical Readings in Christian Apologetics. Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Athanasius, Augustine of Hippo, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, Joseph Butler, William Paley. Personally, I kind of dig like the likes of Joseph Butler and William Paley. I really liked reading natural theology and hearing the watchmaker argument in its strongest original form. So it's a good distillation of some of the, you know, most notable apologetics works since the early church. So if you're a student of apologetics, take to heart that quote that I just said, you know, your education's not complete if only secondary sources have been read.
Yeah, I was going to say that's so important, too, because I remember when I was first getting into apologetics, and I mean, gosh, how long is that now? Let's see, like 20 years ago. And I would read a book by a Christian, whether it was a philosopher, a theologian, an apologist, whatnot, and they would quote Dawkins or something, because that was kind of I think we're post Dawkins now, and it frustrates me that he still gets so much focus on him. I think there are much better, more eloquent atheists out there. But at the time, he was kind of the foremost atheist in public, in pop atheist culture, if you will. And someone would quote him, and then I would talk to somebody about Dawkins as if I had read his stuff. You know what I mean? Well, you know, so-and-so said, Dawkins says this, and I never meant to be deceptive. But when I look back on it now, it makes I could totally see how somebody would think, wow, he must have read Richard Dawkins, where I'd only read a secondary source. And so I think before we're so quick to tear down somebody's argument, that, like you said, when you hear the Paley argument, the watchmaker argument in its entirety, it's much more robust than what typically skeptics and even some Christians present it as, right? Well, I think, you know, to give benefit of the doubt, we should read somebody regardless of their view in their entirety, and to be fair, and to go back to that original source.
Yeah. One of the things that you never hear with the watchmaker argument, for instance, is Paley talks about how it has all these intricate mechanisms for telling time and seeing the display and all of that, and the clear glass and all of that. But you never hear anybody talk about how he mentions now, on top of all of that, imagine this watch has within it the mechanism to create further watches and self-replicate. So
Yeah.
like when you start talking about that, how, he's sort of adding the biological function onto the watch that the body has, or that biological systems have, self-replication and self-repair. That strengthens the argument quite a bit when you start thinking about, that's designed, of course, but it's not as complex as biological systems. That's just an example of how, whoa, I never realized he said that. It's because you didn't read the original thing,
Yeah, I remember specifically when you read Paley for the first time, it was when you were doing your degree.
Yeah.
And I remember we were, I don't know if we were on the phone or we were FaceTime. I don't know what we were doing, but I remember your words specifically. You had read Paley and you were so impressed. And you said, man, he's like, I had no idea. Paley's like, everything's evidence for God. That was kind of your, I remember that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, too, is I like how some of the ID theorists here, I'm thinking of someone like Dembski, who have kind of taken Paley's watchmaker argument and not only would Dembski, I can't say this for sure, but I suspect Dembski would definitely see the merit in it like you do. But also he's kind of taken it and said, look, this watchmaker argument has become more powerful with some of the things that we have discovered about DNA, some of the things we've discovered about the fine tuning of the universe. And so I also like how ID theorists have kind of built upon Paley's the structure of Paley's argument, if you will.
Yeah. I want to come back to what you said about reading the atheist sources and reading Dawkins, for instance. Sometimes I think maybe it's possible for a Christian to, if I read that I'm going to doubt, or like they might fear doubting or having unanswered questions. And of course, maybe that's the case. But my experience with reading some of the Richard Dawkins stuff was, really? This is what everybody's getting worked up about? So sometimes you hear these arguments, or you hear what they're saying so many times, you think, well, it must be pretty heavy. But then when you go and you read it, for me, in that particular case, it was just like, this is what everybody's getting worked up about. So it was actually sort of encouraged me, instead of making me doubt or question or coming away like reeling from, oh man, now what am I going to do here? Now, that's one aspect. Now, here's another thought, though. I do think that, say, reading someone like Dan Barker, where they're not necessarily, here's my scientific objections, where it's emotional, experiential, they have a real axe to grind, and it comes across more emotional.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that you can come away reading that sort of stuff probably in a worse place, simply because it just drags you down. To hear someone so angry and expressing like bad experiences they've had and just kind of bombing you with lots of emotional hits,
Right.
How could God allow this? How could God allow that? Because you're hearing it with the emotional force, rather than when you read something like that's more of like, here's my philosophical argument, or here's my scientific argument, where you're like, I don't think that's that strong. It's not persuasive. But the emotional toll that certain writers can get you with, or YouTube videos, you name it, could be probably worse off if you're not prepared for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It really depends on also, I think, personalities. I think some people are going to tend to be more swayed by a philosophical or scientific argument, where somebody else is going to be very persuaded by those emotional appeals and how could God do X, or, so this happened to person A, how could God allow that to happen? Those types of arguments can be very persuasive, especially if somebody's coming and listening to those arguments from a place of heightened emotion or heartbreak or something like that. Another thing you mentioned, too, is when you were talking about Dawkins and how when you read Richard Dawkins, and I think specifically you're probably talking there more about the God delusion, because that was the one that got a lot of people worked up, right? It was. I agree. As you read it, you think, wow, there's nothing to this. There's nothing persuasive here. It's sloppy. I think it betrays a lot of his ignorance of the topics. And I think that also when you look at some of Bart Ehrman's arguments that he makes, I kind of liken those types of arguments to bottle rockets. Do you remember the old, at 4th of July bottle rockets? They kind of, they shoot off and they have like kind of an impressive pop, right? And then but then after a short period of time, they just fizzle into nothing, right? And I see a lot of Ehrman's arguments and people like Dawkins, where I do think Ehrman's arguments are more sophisticated than Dawkins, to be fair to him. But when you first hear them, they have this bang of scholarly authority, right? But when you really look below the surface of them, they kind of fizzle out. You know, for example, Ehrman talking about the number of differences in the manuscripts. Well, when you realize the majority of those have to do with spelling and, you know, minor errors, and that none of them affect the core doctrines of Christianity, that just kind of fizzles out, you know. But then there are arguments like Schellenberg's hiddenness argument or Draper's evidential argument from evil that they might cause you to wrestle with more. But if Christianity's true, that wrestling is only going to draw us closer to God, and that we don't have to be afraid necessarily of those arguments, because even if we don't see the answer straight away, even if we spend an amount of time wrestling with a premise, eventually the answer is going to present itself if Christianity's true, right? And so hopefully that offers comfort, too, for people who are looking into those arguments. I do think, though, that you need to be wise you need to make sure that you have good grounding in some of the theistic arguments before you go digging into some of that stuff.
It does depend on maybe where you're at. You know, I can see maybe what I was saying there could be taken wrong, like a new Christian or someone, I won't be shaken by reading atheist literature or something. Well, yeah, you very well could. I think William Lane Craig has addressed some of these things where you can, if you just delve into that, you can be overwhelmed by it. I was thinking the likes of The Greatest Show on Earth by Dawkins.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah.
He's going to play out the case for evolution, and, you know, he's the man, so let's hear what he has to say. I'm ready, and that was like, really?
Yeah. I remember that review.
Dog breeding?
Yeah, you wrote a great review on Apologetics 315 back in the day on that, and I do remember that. I forgot about that one. Yeah, I forgot you read that. But no, I think too, for me, one of the things when I started assessing the arguments is that I wish somebody would have said to me, like, Chad, there are answers out there. You don't have to feel like, if you first hear an argument and you feel the force of an argument, that's okay. It's just going to cause you to think and learn and grow more. Don't feel like, oh my gosh, I can't answer this right now, therefore my entire faith is going to crumble. No, that's where you seek out answers and you think through it and you pray through it. I have found that answers eventually present themselves. Now, does that mean I still don't have moments of, doubt or struggle with some of the more powerful arguments, like some of the ones I mentioned? Sure. But I'm sure that if we had Ben Watkins on here from Real Atheology, I'm sure he'd admit that there are things like, he tweeted one time, it made me laugh. He said things that keep me up at night. And one of the things on the list was Richard Swinburne. So we all have that, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on,
Yeah, I am reminded about what Winter Unite said about the helpfulness of watching debates, how it allows you to get a little bit of a thick skin and hear both sides at the same time, back and forth. You sort of learn the issues, sort of the landscape. And then you get used to sitting with that, the discomfort of looking at both views and maybe not having your questions answered immediately. So you're getting a dose of both at the same time.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that maybe that's a great tip would be, read original sources, read the debate so that going in sort of both sides you're dealing with, that it's never one-sided, never one-sided.
Yeah. And I think also, too, that one of the things that, again, going back and thinking like, what do I wish I would have known? And, I realize I learned it and there was a purpose in that. I understand all that. But I also wish that I would have looked at atheists like I have learned a great deal from atheists, and I have been challenged by them. And so, in one sense, yes, you want to reach them for Christ. You want to present the best arguments you can. But at the same time, don't be so arrogant or closed-minded that when you're reading, for example, Jeffrey J. Lauder from the Secular Outpost, I mean, I've been challenged by his arguments. He's pointed things out to me that has sharpened me and made me, I think, better at assessing arguments. And had I not, and again, this isn't like, oh, look at me. It's just, I'm saying I learned this.
Yeah.
Had I not been open to reading him, I wouldn't have learned those things. And of course, if Lauder and I were in a room together and we were assessing various arguments, he and I would disagree with one another on various things, but at least we would be using kind of similar tools to disagree,
Yeah. Well, I'll kick it over to you. Pick a topic. Cornucopia Day.
Oh, hey, the Cornucopia of Topics. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Mars Hill, the rise and fall of Mars Hill.
Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed.
I have listened to the first 5 episodes, and I'm about a fourth, maybe a half through the 6th one. And I'm really glad you recommended it to me because it really has solidified. I'll kind of start out with the positive and then point out where I kind of hope that they're going to offer some clarification, if that makes sense. And then I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. And by the way, for listeners, Brian, in our last podcast, recommended to me The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which is a podcast by Christianity Today. And of course, it is about the rise and fall of the Mars Hills Church in Seattle that was headed up by Mark Driscoll. And for those who are thinking of listening, it is not a podcast that spends the entire time tearing apart Mark Driscoll. I've actually been surprised at kind of the even-handedness of it. It's been a nice bonus to see that they also point out many of the great and kind things that Mark did. And again, I'm only 5.5 episodes in. So if you're over there going, you wait, man. But I'm just saying. So what I like about it so far is, first of all, I've already pointed out that it so far it's been pretty even-handed. It's not like, hey, let's demonize Driscoll and make him look like the most evil man in the world. It does talk about his strengths, but then it obviously talks about his weaknesses. But I like the fact that it goes beyond Driscoll. It goes beyond Driscoll in the sense that it's talking about this celebrity culture that we've created in Christianity, this idea of branding in Christianity, and how an ego that is dropped into that environment can just run rampant. It's been very eye-opening in that sense that, did Driscoll have the personality that lend itself to that? Yes. But then at the same time, did a lot of people feed the monster? Yeah, I think they did. You know, you can't feed a monster and then be surprised that he's growing and becoming stronger, right? And so that's been really fascinating, because one of the things I struggle with personally, and again, I can't speak to what it's like over there in the UK. I don't know why. Why did I do a country accent for the UK? What the heck? Anyway,
I don't know, Cletus.
For the UK. All right. Anyway, oh my gosh, I hope Justin Brierley never hears this. I don't know how it is in the UK, but one of the things I see even in smaller churches, not, celebrity pastors necessarily, but when I started listening to the clips that the podcast had from Driscoll, I was amazed at how many pastors that I have heard that said things so much like him. Mm-hmm. Meaning how many pastors, unbeknownst to me, looked at him as some paradigm to emulate.
Yeah. And
that was very troubling. One of the things it talked about was how Driscoll would talk about how hot his wife was, and how he and his wife would, and even get graphic about like the sex acts and the things that they would do in the bedroom, Dude, I used to have a pastor who used to say some of the things they said on the podcast. It was almost verbatim. Yeah. He would talk about how hot his wife was, how he loves to make out with his wife, and all this other stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I totally understand why he thought that was okay. And this was at the time that like Driscoll was peaking. I mean, this was when his books were hot. So that was very eye-opening to me. The other things I hope it clarifies, and then I'll let you kind of react to what I'm saying. The other thing that I hope it clarifies is that some of the things Driscoll taught, for example, they kind of cast a negative light on the fact that Driscoll uses war language a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, Paul uses a lot of war language, right? Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of darkness and kind of the battle between them. So I think there's war language that's merited. You and I have talked about spiritual battle, the armor of God. We've talked about those things. I think what the podcast fails to qualify a little bit, or maybe clarify is a better word, whichever you prefer, is that that's biblical. What the problem is Mark's kind of obsessiveness with it. he overplayed that card, if you will, to the point of it was us against the world. We're the only ones doing it right. And everybody's got to fall in line with us. So, and again, this might be nitpicky. I'm just saying some of the things I kind of was going, yeah, but also Driscoll, when he talked about sex and within marriage, I think the beginning kind of seeds of some of the things he said was true. You know, Paul talks about some of those things. I think the problem is he kind of took his own sexual preferences and he enforced them onto the Bible's teachings, if that makes sense. And I will tell you, I was over at a friend's house watching his kids once, and he had a bookshelf, and there was a Driscoll book on there about marriage. I didn't know anything at the time about Mark Driscoll. Nothing. All I knew is he was the guy that went viral because he flipped out on like the young people in his church and the podcast has this in the intro where he's like, how dare you? Yeah. And I had seen that clip. That was basically all I knew about Mark Driscoll at the time. And I remember picking up the book, and some of the things that he wrote about in that book were just vile. And I remember saying to my friend when he came home the next day, because they went out of town, so we kind of had to overnight there. My family stayed and watched the kids. And I remember saying, like, dude, what's wrong with that guy? I didn't know him I don't even know if I would have known him if you would have showed me a picture.
You wouldn't have known him from the historical Adam.
Exactly. You know, I wouldn't have. But anyway, so
you have to understand the genre that Mark wrote that book. It's mytho marriage book.
Oh, I thought it was mythosexual history. I thought that's what it was. I thought it's mytho. Like, it's like folklore, right? With truth embedded in it. Yeah. Okay, I got it. Great, man. You know what? Now I feel like I have to call my friend and apologize for criticizing his book. Yeah. And
I know.
So anyway, those are some of the thoughts I've had, but I did want to thank you for recommending it. Danielle's listening to it. For listeners that don't know, that's my wife. And but it has confirmed a lot of things that we've wrestled with of like, why is a church, the DNA of a church completely transformed when a new pastor comes to the church? Well, it's because the pastor's the superstar, right? The pastor's the focal point. And that's just where we've gotten off the rails a bit. And so it's been very helpful. Those are some of my thoughts. So what do you think? Any reaction, any kind of kickback? And feel free to again, push back or whatnot. I'm open to that.
No, I don't have any pushback. Yeah, I felt a lot of the same things there. Like, there's certain aspects that are like, okay, yeah, that's true, but it's not what's being said sometimes. It's how it's being said or the motive behind it. Or one thing you mentioned was the marketing driven or how we brand things, you know, and, that's a really tricky thing that I wrestle with even with like doing a podcast, and it's a very small thing. But trying to get subscribers, should I be thinking about subscribers? Who are we making this for? Are we making it to make a name for ourselves? And so I think when those things go unquestioned and what is allowed to grow is the promotion of a personality or the exalting of that, then, as you said, it's like feeding the monster. All of those sort of themes that you see there, like, oh, I saw a pastor say the very same thing or heard him do the same sort of thing. Yeah, man, that was my, okay. Yeah. Seen that, check, seen that, check, seen that, check in a different place.
And politely to interrupt, that was mind blowing to me. I had no idea that was happening. Like, I honestly, I thought that when I heard certain things from pastors that was coming from legitimately their experience. But some of the things I heard, it was just too similar. It was just too similar to be a coincidence.
But here's the weird thing is that certain experiences I went through, they are the same sort of things that you saw happening in the Mars Hill Church, albeit not in a mega church scale, like a wannabe mega church. Sure. You could have gone and said, oh, everything that happened at the church Brian was at has now happened at Mars Hill in a certain degree. You know what I mean? So it's not like this was copied from Mars Hill. I think it just happens because of whatever systems created, that celebrity culture. One of the things they said was, men's retreats can't be men's retreats. They have to be a men's advance. The hilarious thing is that,
wow, yeah,
that the church I went to, they said, well, we should have a men's retreat. Well, we can't call it a men's retreat. We're going to call it a men's advance. I'm like, dude, the same thing happened. It's not like they copied it. Mars Hill was never around then. So you just have this certain mentality or some sort of culture that's made where there's a lot of stuff to wrestle with. It's just really strange. And I guess it's just like, hey, how can we not repeat this? I mean, that's the thing that they keep saying in the podcast is, how can we understand how these things happen and not allow or create an environment where these things happen again? Because obviously, even in the midst of God blessing certain things and seeing fruit in certain ways, those things continue and they grow. One other thing they wrestle with in that podcast is the justification of so many things, or the rationalization, whichever word you want to plug in there. You can always say, but God's blessing it. But look at the fruit.
Yes.
And so you could have a lot of people are blessed by such and such. Therefore, we can excuse this questionable thing because God wouldn't bless it if, otherwise. So that's a thing to question, thing to watch out for.
Yeah. And you know what, too, I wanted to say this circles back in a way, and this might be a stretch, but I don't think it is. But when you first hear it and you're thinking, where are they going with this? Just hang in there. One of the things they mentioned was Driscoll's book on sex. I think it's called like Real Marriage, maybe?
Yeah, Real Marriage.
That was the one that I picked up off my buddy's shelf. One of the things that was fascinating to me was some of the people they mentioned that endorsed the book.
Yeah.
Did you catch that?
Yeah.
These were names. One of them was a name we've quoted. We've used his stuff on this podcast. And so here's how this relates to sources, right? And experts. If I picked up that book and I was relying on experts, I would say, oh, theologian X endorsed this book. Therefore, it must be biblical.
Yeah.
Right? No, you've got to assess the arguments by scripture to decide whether or not they are biblical. And so it ties back to going back to the original sources, right? And not relying on experts to tell you what's true and what's false. They can help educate you and inform you and guide your thinking, but ultimately it's got to come down to the original sources and the arguments.
Yeah.
Or maybe if we're thinking in terms of science, it's got to come down to the data, right? It just depends on the topic we're investigating.
Okay, so here's another tie-in from the past. Remember when we were talking to Dr. Carl Payne about spiritual warfare, and one of the things he was talking about is how we can sort of open the door to spiritual influence or attack. And he cites the scripture, don't let the sun go down on your anger, and give the enemy a foothold. And he talks about that word foothold there being topos, which is a sort of a military term meaning giving ground. So I was kind of came across how John Wesley had these questions he would ask himself every day, founder of Methodism. And so he's very methodical in how he would approach his quest for holiness. After reading the Carl Payne book, I thought, what area am I opening myself up in any way? Is there any unforgiveness I'm holding against people? So I've been more intentional about, is there anybody I need to forgive or grudges I'm holding? Anyway, the thought process that was going through my mind was, I don't want to have sort of an open door or give the enemy any ground. I don't want to go to bed, with an unresolved argument with someone or something like that. Or, if you let unforgiveness sort of like give you a root of bitterness, that kind of a thing. So I kind of asked myself questions before bed, thinking, am I holding any unforgiveness? Kind of do an internal scan, or, is there anything any way I sin today, and I just kind of let that slide and not keeping a short account with the Lord. So I remembered that John Wesley had these 22 questions that he would ask. He had like this holy club when he was a student at Oxford, and they had a small group, and they met for prayer and Bible study and discipleship. So in their private devotions, they'd use these questions to examine their spiritual lives. for spiritual accountability to self-examination. So here are the questions, and I'm just throwing them out there because we're not just talking about apologetics, but spiritual development and our Christian walk and stuff. I just want to throw it out as a resource to for spiritual growth, and I think John Wesley was a pretty good guy. Am I consciously or unconsciously creating the impression that I'm better than I really am? In other words, am I a hypocrite? 2, am I honest in all my acts, words, or do I exaggerate? Do I confidentially pass on to another what was told to me in confidence? Can I be trusted? Am I a slave to dress, friends, work, or habits? Am I self-conscious or self-pitying or self-justifying? Did the Bible live in me today? Do I give it time to speak to me every day? Am I enjoying prayer? When did I last speak to someone else about my faith? Do I pray about the money I spend? Do I go to bed on time and get up on time? Do I disobey God in anything? Do I insist upon doing something about which my conscience is uneasy? Am I defeated in any part of my life? Am I jealous, impure, critical, irritable, touchy, or distrustful? How do I spend my spare time? Am I proud? Do I thank God that I'm not like other people? Is there anyone whom I fear, dislike, disown, criticize, hold a resentment toward, or disregard? Do I grumble or complain constantly? Is Christ real to me? So those are the 22 questions of John Wesley, and if you were going to be part of his holy club, and it wasn't like this holier than thou club, but it was they really wanted to live holy before the Lord, I think he was really onto something there as far as those things of self-examination, because I can't read through that list without that's me, I'm prideful, or, holding resentments or something like that. I find it just, if you don't know what to pray, reading through that be like a great starting point. I don't mean to bring the questions up to be like condemn anybody or bring anybody down, but for me, those things, if you humble yourself before the Lord, he lifts you up, and that just puts us in our proper perspective.
Yeah, as you read through those questions, I mean, obviously this podcast is ultimately an apologetics podcast, even though we go beyond that, such as topics like this, right? But I was thinking that unless you're doing some of those things that the question, not some of those things, unless you're doing those things that the question is alluding to, apologetics is not going to matter.
Yeah, I mean, and at the end of the day, it could be a negative apologetic in a huge way. You're supposed to
exactly.
People are supposed to say, "Oh, wow, that's I don't agree with him, but I can't fault his character." I would rather have them say that than, "Oh, I agree with you, but your character sucks." You know what I mean?
Exactly. Or man, he's really smart and he really won that argument, but gosh, he's such a jerk.
Yeah.
I mean, who wants that as their testimony, right? Or he is dishonest in his job, or he's lazy. Ultimately, we want a balance between our knowledge and our walk, the way we present ourselves. And none of us are perfect. None of us get it right all the time. But there should at least be somewhat of a consistency and a transparency.
Yeah. And the other aspect is like when we were talking about in the previous podcast, the main takeaway, if I could only distill it down to one for that Mars Hill podcast, is that, the character has to be greater than the thing you're building, not the personality. Yes. The personality can build something, but the character is the foundation, and if the foundation's crap, then it's just going to fall apart,
Yeah. And those first few podcasts too, that's kind of the main theme that I took away from it, is that character has, when you're choosing leadership, character has got to matter more than charisma, more than even knowledge. Character's got to matter more. A pastor can learn. So, for example, if somebody picks me as a pastor and I obviously, I'm not saying I do, but I have impeccable character, but I still need to grow in my knowledge of the Bible, I'd rather have that guy, right? Yeah. Than the guy who has impeccable knowledge of the Bible, but whose character is deficient. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that they learned there at Mars Hill, right? Is, wow, we should have focused a lot more on this dude's character instead of his charisma and his ability to bring people in.
Yeah, well, I thought that was a cool resource. All right, what do you got next?
So one of the things that I've kind of evolved my, for lack of a better word, because you'll see why that's kind of funny, my view is kind of evolved on is this question of whether or not intelligent design is science. Mm-hmm. Had you asked me that probably, I don't know, it's hard to put an exact time period on it, 2-3 years ago, I would have been in the camp of arguing passionately that ID is science. My thinking's actually evolved on that. And before you cancel me, podcast listeners, let me explain what I mean. My thinking's kind of evolved in a couple ways. Listening to a good bit of debates and reading a good bit of literature on the relationship between faith and science. And then also our interview with Dr. Stephen Meyer for his new book, The God Hypothesis. And so I used to argue that it absolutely was science. My view now has changed to it depends on how you define science. That's what it boils down to. On one view of science, it is science. On another view of science, it is not. That's my first point. Now, let me explain that a little bit. If I come to science and my definition is more in line with like methodological naturalism, in other words, if I'm saying science is the search for natural causes, right? Well, then in one sense, intelligent design, right? The only kind of intelligent cause that we could have there would be such as like an alien or something like that, right? But it wouldn't be necessarily it wouldn't be a supernatural cause. So in one sense, if you're saying it can only be natural causes and that we can only limit ourselves to a natural cause, I can see how some people, if they're being forthright with what they mean, if intelligent design means, it also boils down to that definition. If intelligent design means an intelligent designer that's beyond the cosmos, well, then no, ID can't be science, right? Now, I know that some ID theorists will say, no, we don't say it's God. Well, yeah, but at the same time, a lot of times that's what we mean, right? So I want to be as transparent there as possible. But if we define science as the search for truth, which for a long time, that's how it was defined, then I think ID is certainly science. And also it depends on how narrow and how broad your view of science is. So here's my point, and then I'll explain that a little bit more. And again, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, so if it's muddled, edit me.
Okay.
Yeah. This basically depends on what do you mean by intelligent design and what do you mean by science? That's what the question boils down to for me. Okay. So in the sense of I look at science and I think like archaeology. Is your definition of science broad enough to include archaeology, or is it narrow to where it's not? What about forensic science? In other words, what J. Warner Wallace does. Is your definition of science broad enough to include that? Or is it too narrow to include that? Because I think if archaeology and forensic science is science, well, then it seems to me that you've got to at least let ID in the door, because it's also the search for an intelligent cause, just like archaeology is and forensic science, is. And so it really depends on your definition of science. And for me, who gets to pick that, right? Who gets to pick your definition of science? And if it's too narrow to include those things we've talked about, I've mentioned, then maybe the problem isn't necessarily ID. Maybe it is your definition of science. And then secondly, I love what Meyer said, and this really allowed me to kind of crack open the egg, if you will, on this topic, was how he said, and I heard him say this when he was doing a discussion with Michael Shermer, and I think he also may have done it with Brian Keating, where they wanted to goad him into this. And I don't mean goad in a I guess that makes them sound disingenuous, and I didn't mean that. They wanted to kind of broach this topic. They wanted to say, should ID be considered science? And Meyer's view is absolutely yes, because we're not defining the intelligent designer. as a supernatural cause. Under our view, the supernatural cause could be something within nature. But he ultimately said, I really don't care if intelligent design is philosophy. I don't care if it's science. I just want to know if it's true.
Yeah.
And so twofold, I'll kind of sum up and then I'll let you kind of push back. Is intelligent design science? That depends on what you mean by intelligent design. And I have found that through my reading, I think more pure intelligent design theorists just mean an intelligent cause. When there's detectable design, we should be able to infer design. But who the designer is, we kind of pivot to philosophy and theology to figure out who that is. Other people do define intelligent design as a supernatural creator. So it depends on what you mean by ID, but it also depends on what you mean by science. And so at the end of the day, does it really matter too much? I think Meyer's right. We can debate the definition of ID. We can debate the definition of science. But at the end of the day, what matters is it true? And so I don't passionately feel the need to prove anymore that intelligent design is science. Is it philosophy? I just want to know if the premises of their arguments are true.
When you're talking about this, I kind of think about, well, why did the question originally become even important? I tend to think that it came about simply as a pushback from evolutionary thinkers to delegitimize the idea of intelligent design. I have the impression that when someone is saying, hey, look, intelligent design from the evolutionary biology perspective, those who are like don't want that to be on equal footing as that, well, this is not science. This is religion dressed up as science. This is
right. The old Trojan horse argument.
Yeah.
Right?
This is your way of smuggling creationism in a cheap tuxedo, I think is the way that they had characterized intelligent design theory. So I think that whole idea of, well, is it science or not, was just a debate over this attempt to delegitimize intelligent design because they just thought, well, you're just creationists trying to get the Bible in there. So, well, maybe I don't know what the motives are of people doing what they're doing, but I agree with you in what you said about, well, I just want to know if it's true or not. So I think if someone is, from the common use of the word science, if you wanted to just answer the question apart from why are they asking the question, I think the answer is what you said. It depends what you mean by science and depends on what you mean by intelligent design. But if by science you mean looking for causes with a motive of finding what is the true cause behind a certain phenomenon, and you're not closing your doors, if you're not committed to methodological naturalism and your quest is truth, and intelligent design is simply looking at or being open to the idea that there's an intelligent causation and not just natural random causation, sort of following the evidence where it leads, I think it's completely legit to do that. People start parting ways when they decide whether or not they think that you can have something that is supernatural or not. Okay, as soon as you say that it's not a natural cause, that it's a mind or an intelligence that is disembodied or something, then they're going to be like, well, you can't go there. So I suppose that's when people start dropping off, depending on where they're at on that spectrum. But to summarize, my view is that I'm more concerned about truth quest versus, I'm only going to do science, and here's how I define science, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And as you were talking, one of the things I wanted to say, too, is at least, sometimes I do listen to other thinkers and I feel like they're trying to avoid an answer on a question. And so at least anybody think I'm doing that and I'm attempting to somehow muddy the waters. I just would want to say a couple things. First of all, I am of the opinion that intelligent design, I would say, is science. The reason I say it is because my definition of science is it is the search for truth. I think that my view of intelligent design is more consistent with a classical ID theorist view, where they would say that science can only get us so far. And if we can find detectable design, and of course, people can look into Dembski's design inference and assess the viability of that or not. But I think that if there is detectable design, that we should be able to infer design. And then I have no problem kicking it over to philosophy and theology to see who the designer is. I think that's actually putting the disciplines in their proper categories. And the disciplines aren't overstepping their bounds. I'm quite happy with that. That's where I come down on it. And I think that I think they do a good job of presenting arguments that suggest that there's detectable design in nature. And I think philosophy and theology is where we go to find out who that is. But again, it depends on what your definitions of intelligent design and science are. And so the reason I bring that up, and maybe I should have been more clear about this from the onset, and Brian hinted at it, is if you're having a discussion with somebody and it comes to whether or not science can discover whether there's a creator or is intelligent design, should it be science? I think the most important thing is to kind of go back to what Greg Kokel would call Columbo questions and talk about what do you mean by those things? What do you mean by intelligent design? What do you mean by science? Because you guys might be closer than you think, and you might be just tripping over definitions.
Yes. Well, to wrap up the intelligent design thing, I suppose the best way to advise our readers is to go read William Paley.
Yeah.
Go read William Paley, Natural Theology. Go do it. Well, I don't know where you're at with music, Chad, but I like the good old days when you found albums that you could just listen to, and you're like, well, this album, not just this couple of songs, a single here, a hit there.
Right.
You know, I don't like having on my iTunes or whatever, like it shows an album, but really I only downloaded one song that was good. I like finding something I can listen the whole way through that whole album for 40 minutes, an hour, or whatever. And it's like, man, that album, good. Well,
yeah.
I don't know what your taste in music is, and I'm just throwing this out there for the listeners under the heading of stuff Brian likes, that if you think you might like it too, check it out. So I have two albums that for the past 2 or 3 years, they have been on constant, like I just listen to them over and over. The first one is by a band called MUTEMATH. Now they've disbanded now, but MUTEMATH, MUTEMATH. So MUTEMATH, I think their best album is called Changes. So that's the one I've just listened to piles. Just go listen to it. I found that the more I listen to it, the more it just like so intricate. And the thing about MUTEMATH is there's just so many layers of sound and sounds and effects and melodies. And then the drummer, Darren King, is one of the best drummers of all time, I'd say. And
for listeners that don't know, Brian is a actual drummer that was in a band for quite a long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
But now, funny enough, in the Changes album, the drumming is not like over the top. Most of the other albums, the drumming is just insane. But this one, it's really laid back and there's a lot of digital aspects to it. But the Changes album is my favorite, and it's been in the top plays for ages. Now, here's the next album, and it's probably my favorite album as well. 21 Pilots, the album called Trench.
Ah, yes.
I think if I had two albums that were masterpieces, I'd say Changes and Trench. I could just play them from start to finish, and you're never going to have a skip song. How some of those albums, I've got a couple of these where you listen to a few songs and you skip, and then you listen to another song, skip.
Sure.
Trench is amazing, and it's just so deep and wide. It's just amazing. So for those looking for music that's cool, now here's the bonus, and I'll link this in the show notes. There is this collaboration between MUTEMATH and 21 Pilots, and it's called 21 Pilots, the MUTEMATH Sessions. And it's a 20-minute YouTube video of like 4 or 5 songs that they do together off of 21 Pilots' album called Blurry Face. And a lot of these songs are hits, and so they're familiar. But I've watched this video probably about 25 times because it's just beautiful to watch these musicians that are just brilliant. And then you've got 2 drummers playing together, which is even a bigger bonus. So 2 albums that are masterpieces in my view, MUTEMATH Changes and 21 Pilots Trench. And then the bonus video to watch where you get a feel for both of them is 21 Pilots, the MUTEMATH Sessions. It's only about 20 minutes, 5 songs, and you can download all of them on iTunes, of course. But that's my music recommendations for the week.
Excellent. All right. Real quick, I'll give a real quick kind of explanation of my musical taste. So before I was a Christian, I was angry drunk. And I was a big Kid Rock fan. Went to Kid Rock concerts, had all his songs memorized. Yeah, I was a big Kid Rock fan, loved Kid Rock, loved Metallica. So that was kind of my musical taste. So, but I always loved Southern rock as well. And Kid Rock does have that kind of flavor to some of his stuff. And I love Lynyrd Skynyrd, Creedence, stuff like that. So when I got saved, if anybody knows anything about Kid Rock, you really can't listen to Kid Rock without being convicted. This was before Kid Rock did any kind of country that was more like mellow, and before he kind of grew up a bit. This was when he was still, everything was about just things that as a Christian you don't want to really dwell on. So I was kind of in a pickle as far as music goes, and I discovered Third Day. Third Day is straight up Southern rock. I love Mac Powell, the lead singer. His voice is literally my favorite voice on the planet. I just love it. And they have retired since, but I was able to see them in concert numerous times. And their last album was called Revival. And if you love Southern rock, their last album is literally my favorite of theirs. So I love that. I also love blues a lot. Keb Mo is a blues artist that I really enjoy. Also Robert Johnson, which, really old blues, and Eric Clapton's redone a lot of his stuff, and I like that. And if I'm in it, sometimes for me, music depends on a mood. If I'm more in kind of an aggressive mood, or I enjoy Skillet. I do enjoy Skillet quite a bit. And so those are kind of that's kind of where I am musically. Yeah, interesting kind of background there. I could talk a lot about music, and some of the people I saw in concert, you would, what? But anyway, that's kind of where.
Would it turn me white?
One of them would. Yes. One of them would. Yeah.
Well, we need to wrap up with a listener email.
Oh.
And this is, I'm just so impressed by this email. It's from Johnny Dom. And
Bless you.
Here's what it goes. I mean, this shows you our readership.
Okay.
We are a group of scientists from MIT, have taught artificial intelligence with 100% accuracy to determine altcoins that will increase in price by at least 15,000%. I'm kind of impressed. I knew that we had a smart listenership, but these guys are into AI. At the beginning of this year, with the help of our trained AI, we identified 5 altcoins and invested $30 in them. And as a result, we earned $5,750,000 in 5 months. 5 days ago, our AI identified 18 more new altcoins that will grow by at least 15,000% each. And we decided to put this list of altcoins up for sale. So I just read that for two reasons. One is that we've got some really smart listeners, and they're willing to support us in this way. So if you enjoyed the podcast and you want to help support us, you can do that by becoming a monthly donor. And this is the sort of stuff that we invest in as well. There's exclusive Apologetics 315 t-shirts that you can only get by being a monthly donor. And you can find out more about that at apologetics315.com. So just click on the donate tab. Those donations are tax deductible, and you can see the sort of thing that we will put this money to use for.
Oh, I'm literally crying, by the way. I wonder who does their taxes.
Right. I've got one more thing to share with our listeners, and that is this. We have conference DVDs, apologetics books, and other swag that you can get. There's books like The Case for Resurrection of Jesus, Putting Jesus in His Place, True Reason, Did God Really Command Genocide, Spiritual Warfare and Missions, Contending with Christianity's Critics, Forensic Faith, Evidence for God, Case for the Real Jesus, and some DVDs of conferences, Gospel Differences, Genocide in Scripture, that sort of thing. So if you enjoyed the podcast and you would leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or your podcast player, just take a screenshot of that review, email it to us at podcast@apologetics315.com, and we'd love to send you your choice of one of these books or DVDs and send it to you free of charge. So either way, we do appreciate your podcast reviews. It helps us to get the word out and grow the podcast. So, of course, any feedback about the podcast, we'd love to hear, along with your questions. So you can just email us at podcast@apologetics315.com. Chad, your thoughts on that great listener email and this team over at MIT? I mean, this is big, Peter.
I mean, it just reminds me of the time you tried to drill a hole through your head.
Well, that would have worked. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Isn't it time to awaken a journey filled with wonder on a celebrity cruise? Drinks, Wi-Fi, and tips are always included. Plus, book by December 13th to get 50% off your second guest's cruise fare. Visit Celebrity.com, call 1-800-CELEBRITY, or contact your travel advisor. Celebrity Cruises. Journey safe. Journey wonderful. Offer applies to select sailings. Additional restrictions apply. Visit Celebrity.com for details. Ships Registry, Malta.
At Idea Public Schools, we're more than K-12 schools that are open to all students. We're dreamers. We're scholars. We're creators. We're leaders. We're the future. And our success starts now. Apply to attend Idea Public Schools for the 2022-2023 school year by visiting ideapublicschools.org/apply.